How Black the Sky by T.J. Marquis. Blackness like he'd never seen. A deep, utter, all-enveloping absence of light. How far had he fallen? He knew his body had grown tough, but how had he survived? It was a miracle that nothing had crushed him. Curse his bad luck. He lay on the ground waiting for his senses to come back to him. Slowly they did. Mostly he heard the thick silence of a lonely place. Every few seconds liquid dripped somewhere far off. The dark world smelled musty, but cold. It was cold, wasn't it? The chill had gotten into his armor, numbing his skin. He couldn't see anything. He did have a light, though. Carefully, as if afraid he might break himself, Pierce sat up. He felt around him to make sure he was not on some precarious ledge looming over the chasmic depths. The ground was damp, but not an endless puddle. He searched his body. No debris had impaled him. His armor seemed intact. His sword was back in its scabbard. He didn't remember sheathing it. He drew it. The blue light of the blade was blinding at first, lighting up the area as well as any torch. His eyes adjusted and he could see that the ground was of stone and flat. His eyes were frustrated to see only so far and be caged by the dark. He looked up. All was black. There was no sign of the moon, no haze of a distant town. If he had fallen into the Underlands, it was in deep wilderness. He'd never heard of the moon being absent, but he supposed it could be part of the cycle here. Pierce had no food or water, only his weapons and wit. He needed to find his friends. He picked a direction and started out, watching the ground carefully to be certain he wasn't about to step off an edge and into the chasm. Would the banshees rip him apart before he hit the bottom? If there was one? He could only hope that the rest of Gorgonbane, or even some of the garrison men, would see his light and come to him. He could only hope that some foul denizens of these depths would not spot him first. He guessed he'd walked a mile or so before he came to the edge of the chasm. At least he had to assume it was the actual chasm. It could be some lesser crevice for all he knew. If it was the true abyss, that meant the ultra-monstrosity had thrown the earth under F's tower inland. Or this part of the Underlands stuck out further over the chasm than Overland above it. There was no way to know. He decided to assume the former was the truth. That meant his comrades could and should be somewhere between here and the place where he'd woken. It was a large area to search in, especially in the dark. Again, he had to hope that the terrain was all as flat as it seemed, so the others would have a chance at seeing the light of his sword. Pierce started back in the direction he'd come. This time he called out names every 30 steps or so. Scythia! Axeborn? Aggie? He used the hated nickname to increase his chances of a robust response. S? Sev? He didn't call out to the first. He was certain the man must be dead. He came across S first. Her response was weak, so soft he might have missed it if he hadn't paused to listen as a part of his search pattern. He kept calling her name as he approached the sound of her scratchy whispers. He found her. She was lying on a slab of rubble, eyes half-lidded, their white paint tinted blue by his sword. She reached up toward him. He grasped her hand. Though a certain electric heat shot through his body on the contact, her skin was deathly cold. He helped her up and she fell into his arms. "Legs are weak," she rasped. "I do not think anything is broken, though. I think I managed to levitate some of the momentum away." He felt guilty, his hands enjoying the feel of her shoulder blades beneath her robe. He had the ridiculous urge to hold her around the waist as if they'd come together at a dance after a feast. He would have slapped himself into sense if he could. "You look no worse for wear," she said with a wan smile. Pierce couldn't look right at her. "Just a little sore," he said. "You remind me of Agrathor in his younger days," she said. "I've heard that before. I suppose it's an honor, though I don't plan to be quite so grumpy in my old age." S laughed softly, coughed when the last laugh scratched her dry throat. "Or to lose your flesh, I would hope," she said. There was more rubble to negotiate in this area, mostly broken earth from Overland, occasionally a stray block of stone from Chasmgard. A precious few of those still shone with a weak green glow, as if holding on to their lost identity. They searched painstakingly in the dark for some time, Pierce trying to memorize the sights of each area they passed through, keeping to a search pattern that would be difficult in the endless dark, but the piles of rubble grew in this direction, creating more landmarks to make note of. Eventually, S was more steady on her feet and added the light of her orbs to that of Pierce's sword. That helped a little with keeping their bearings. The liquid surface of the strange spheres shone silver now, like the light of the absent moon. Pierce had been worried about the second, had waited to ask what he was dying to know. He couldn't wait anymore. "I saw the enchantment almost work," he said. "Why did it fail?" She was a long time in answering, but Pierce let her have the silence. He imagined she must be in mourning for the failure, for the loss of her master. She must be worried about her comrades. "I believe," she said at last, "that the magic simply was not compatible with the nature of the sky. It tried to work, we all saw it light up blue, but then it failed. I will not know for certain until I speak with the first." "So it didn't have anything to do with the attack of those shadow people?" Pierce asked. He had been worried they were the cause of the failure, worried it was his fault for not finding a way to stop them. "Ah, the super again," S said. "My kin. But those who still serve Cash, no, Pierce. They clashed with us after the enchantment failed. You saw the explosion?" Pierce nodded. "Simple fire magic, but effective. They needn't have tried so hard to stop us," S said thoughtfully. "Though it is interesting that they cared to." "You think Cash's spies realized what we were up to?" "Almost certainly," S said. She stumbled over a chunk of rock and fell into Pierce. He helped right her again. "Why is it odd that they tried then?" Pierce asked. S looked up at him as if the answer should be obvious. "Well, it means you were right about the color blue. They hate it. May even be a poison to them in large amounts. If we had succeeded, Overland might be inhospitable to them. What I think is interesting, though, is that they cared to sabotage the enchantment when it was not going to work anyway. Perhaps Cash did not know any better than we did, though somehow I doubt it." Pierce thought about this. Something in all of it felt wrong, but he couldn't figure out what. "The first should have known," Pierce said. "He shouldn't have been so confident if it wasn't going to work." S waved a hand tiredly. "You may have noticed that humility was not his strong suit." Pierce shrugged. He hadn't really considered the man's disposition to be prideful. He'd taken it as more of an old man's confidence. S would know better than he would, though. "In any case," he started. Then they heard a voice. It was calling out the names of the members of Gorgonbane, as Pierce had done. "It's Scythia," Pierce said. "Scythia!" he called. "Pierce!" she called back. Over a rise in the rubble, there appeared a vaguely humanoid form made up of small hazy points of light. Scythia's gems, she must have activated them to shed some light. They came together atop a hill of broken earth, and Scythia gave S a powerful hug. "Just you two so far?" she asked. The others nodded. Scythia looked worried. "The tower's wreckage is widespread," said S by way of comforting the other woman. They hadn't even set out again when they saw the flash of lightning in the distance. It could only be one person. "Agrathor!" Scythia hollered, dashing off in that direction. Pierce supported S and they followed more slowly. The skeleton man held his electric spear aloft, illuminating his path. It proved a worthy beacon to lead his comrades to him. Scythia hugged him as well, an awkward embrace due to his armour and lack of meat, but warm all the same. "You haven't seen Axior the First?" she asked Agrathor. "No," he said, "and I never lost consciousness. I feel as if I've been searching for hours." "Well," said Scythia, turning away, "if their need was urgent, I would sense it. They'll be okay." She seemed to be trying to convince herself. They followed the mountain wreckage until they came to the edge of the chasm. This brought Pierce at least in something of a loop, but it was impossible to tell how close he'd been to this exact spot during his first circuit. A large portion of the tower had collapsed here. There were no heaps and mounds of broken stone. Everyone called out to Axborn and the First. Pierce called out for Sev. With every shout, Pierce felt certain that something terrible would emerge from the depthless dark to attack. Thankfully, nothing did. "They could be in the rubble," Agrathor said. "We won't know unless we dig." He went straight into it, grasping blocks of stone, both whole and shattered, tossing them aside or into the chasm. Pierce joined him, then Scythia. S sat down in exhaust, but slowly put her telekinesis to work, removing rubble as well. They had to be careful as they did this, excavating from top of each mound and downward. They had worked their way through several smaller mounds and moved on to a higher pile of the tower's wreckage, when Pierce caught sight of a faint blue light. It was bobbing slightly at eye level, an indeterminate distance away, swimming through the dark. Someone must have just come up a rise. "Sev?" Pierce called, raising his sword. The bobbing paused, and a voice called back faintly. It was the Forge Master's. He carried a leftover chunk of luminous crystal. Pierce wanted to rush and collect him, but doing anything quickly in this near-pitch blackness was unwise. He held his sword higher and waited for Sev to come nearer. He stopped at the bottom of the pile. Pierce was on and called up. "The others are with you," Sev said. "All but Axborn and the First," Pierce called back. Sev paused. "I can take you to them," he said. Even his normally flat voice sounded grey when he said this. Something must be wrong. "What is it?" Pierce asked. "I dug them out of the rubble, Pierce," Sev said. "They are dead." Scythia wouldn't believe it when Pierce found her and told her. She kept thinking, he's too tough. We've been through too much. Yet, when she bent the circlet of knowing towards Sev, it revealed him as honest. She had another question for the Forge Master, but the question scared her, and she decided to wait. First, she needed to see Axborn for herself. There was a little hollow in the tower's rubble where Sev had dug the bodies out. He said he'd seen Axborn's halberd sticking out of the ruins, an unmistakable marker. He had laid the bodies out as if they were sleeping, left the big man's weapon laying across his chest. Scythia had no words, no thoughts even. She fell on Axborn's body and wept. Her sorrow was violent, penetrating. It was 1,000 times deeper than what she'd experienced on hearing the destruction of Chasm Reach, or of learning of the death of her parents several years ago. Axie had been her friend, companion, comrade. All these things and more. He'd known her like a brother and cared for her in all ways like a father. How many times had they saved each other's lives? How many close calls had there been? with long nights of frantic love to push away the darkness of war and bloodshed. There would be no other lover like him, no one so completely and utterly hers. All these thoughts and an endless cascade of inexpressible feelings flooded through her veins and nerves, filling her deepest parts, both carnal and ethereal, with loss, and a void darker than the bottom of the chasm. Pierce watched in empathy and discomfort as Scythia continued to sob over the corpse of her husband. The others watched for a few moments, then turned away and left the little hollow. It was hard to know which was the right thing to do, to come beside her in her grief or to leave her to it and let it run its course. Pierce quietly approached the body of the first. It seemed like someone should be mourning him too. Why wasn't S doing so? Perhaps to fall on his body and weep like Scythia was not her way. The man's eyes were closed. Sev must have done that. F looked frail in his well-worn robes. Blood had seeped through in places. Strangely, his face looked a little blue. Either the fall or the explosion had killed him. The bloody spots must be from severely broken bones where the skin had been ruptured. Pierce stole a glance at Scythia. She didn't even know he was there. Her face was buried in her husband's chest. Her sobs were heart-wrenching. Pierce felt gingerly up both of F's arms. There were breaks all the way up and places where the bones had simply been shattered. Had death come quickly? The bones in his legs were much the same. It was possible the pain from so many bones being simultaneously broken would have caused F to black out. That would have been a mercy. Despite all his power, it seemed he wasn't as durable as S and the rest of Gorgonbane. Pierce thought that odd. He had the urge to inspect Axborn as well, but he could not simply ask Scythia to move aside. He had seen that man resist the massive weight of a monstrosity's hand as it tried to smash him. The red-bearded barbarian had held the thing down as if he were restraining a child. It was hard to believe any explosion or fall could have killed him. Pierce took one last look at F, saying a short prayer to the blacksmith for his soul, and left the hollow to Scythia and Axborn. All around the tower's wreckage they found the bodies of Underlanders. They left them where they lay. Most of the Gen and werewolves were in pieces, torn either by S's orange orbs or Agrathor's lightning. They found a few of the garrison men's bodies as well. Here and there were dead Supragen, jet black skin and clothes camouflaging them in the darkness. They buried their dead comrades in cairns made of stone from the chasm verge. Axborn and the first among them. Some of the stone blocks still glowed faintly green. S prayed alone over the first grave for a long time. But Scythia had already cried herself out and stood back with the remainder of Gorgonbane. They prayed together to the blacksmith. Everyone knew that death was inevitable. It meant you were fully forged and tempered, ready to be carried along the glorious paths where all evil and injustice would be vanquished with overwhelming and holy might. Axborn was finished, and the first as well. They would be glorified. They would live with the blacksmith and all other holy ones from now on. This knowledge did not make the loss of Axborn any easier. Every battle would be harder. Scythia would never be the same, and each round of jibes, tales or discussions of Gorgonbane's plans would be lacking the spice that only Axborn could provide. Someone would have to tell Sugar if she had survived the invasion. The first would be missed, but in a less personal sense. It had been good to know that someone with his great power was alive and working in the world. Pierce wondered how S felt about her master's death. She hadn't given away much, but he supposed she would talk to someone if she felt the need. There was a long period of silence after the impromptu memorial, and one by one Gorgonbane walked away from the cairns. Scythia left last. When she did, there was a hardness in her gait that Pierce had never seen. It was clear that she had a plan. She strode up to the Forge Master first, and he looked down at her with a questioning brow. "Did you kill them? Were they alive when you found them?" she asked without preamble. Sev's brow unknitted, and he looked sad for her. "I did not, Mom. They were already dead and cold." Scythia studied him intensely, gems on her circlet pulsing like a bird's heart. After a long moment, she nodded and strode away. She went to S next. "Can you fold me straight to Cash?" she asked. "Do you know where he could be? Or if the Forge Master can guess, could you do it?" S shook her head slowly. Her voice sounded weary and morose. "I cannot. I am able to fold quite far, but I cannot take anyone with me. You would have to learn it for yourself." Scythia nodded again. She glanced in the direction of the chasm, then started walking straight away from it, inland. The others scrambled to follow. "Scythia, what are you doing?" Agrithor asked, jogging to keep up with her long strides. "What do you think?" she said, not looking back at him. "I think you're going to try and kill Cash," he said. "I love the idea, but you can't do it alone." "Watch me," Scythia ground. "We couldn't even do it together," Agrithor shouted. Scythia wheeled on him. He skidded to a stop. "I have always been Gorgonbane's level head," she said fiercely. "I have always been the understanding sister and patient mother. With him at my side, I could spare the effort. I never minded filling that role, but now he is gone. There is nothing left for me but recklessness and fury. I will live up to the bold memory of that wonderful man, to the fiery redness of his glorious mane. If I have to collect 1,000 gems and dash my way into Cash's palace, or whatever fortress he's holed up in, I will do that. They will not see me coming, and the Underlord will be dead before anyone can come to his aid." She started walking away again. Pierce, S and Sev had caught up. "If I have to torture and interrogate every last one of his minions," Scythia continued, "I will do that. Let the blood flow. Let their bruises pulse as their hearts beat fear into their veins. I myself will send them to be trod upon the glorious paths, and when I meet the blacksmith, he will congratulate me." Even in a calm state, there was no arguing with Scythia, so Agrithor fell back with the others and gave them the closest thing he could to a bewildered look. His flame eyes went round and dim. No one had any words for her, but they were still Gorgonbane. They would march forward together, though the dark remained deep and they had no idea where they were. Cash had folded back up to Testadel after ordering the sacking of Chasm Verge. Agrata had suggested sending a squad of her elites to make sure the job got done, and he had agreed this would be prudent. Everything had gone as expected. Even the first Grand Master had not the power to both repel a direct assault from ground troops and defend himself from the unprecedented attack of the ultra monstrosity from below. Cash laughed. He would have loved to see that thing in action, but he hadn't wanted to be in range of revenge. The day he'd discovered his faithful giant's elder brothers, well, it had been a real turning point for his plans. So much had been made possible by the Ultras. He stood on the balcony of a high minaret, overlooking the fortress and the ruined city outside it. Gen and humans were working together to clean up the wreckage and rubble, carting anything that could be reused to various staging areas, and the rest to designated dumps and pyres. So far, most of the humans were cooperating, and for this, Cash was thankful. The ones that resisted incorporation were sent to the prisons and isolated. He much preferred their willing assistance to anything compulsory, like slavery. If all continued to go well, a new city would be built where Grondel had once stood, with Testadel as its heart. He really only expected pushback when it came to the worship of their blacksmith god. That too would be straightened out with time. Cash's advisors had recommended a policy of syncretism, to which the Underlord had reluctantly agreed. Anything was worth it to get everyone working together for a common goal. They had to be ready, all of them, for what was coming next. Divided, they would certainly fall to the powers of false light rising from below. United, however, they would have a chance not only to resist and survive, but thrive in the new world that was coming, and expand the light of the known world into those dark regions as yet unseen. Cash sighed. If the first had listened, things might have been easier. If he had listened when Cash had visited him, well, it wasn't worth dwelling on. Things were done that could not be undone. The second might come for him, but he thought not. From what he knew of her, she was fairly impassive in her old age. Most likely she would continue to keep her own counsel, plumbing the depths of the theory and the chasm until she was satisfied with the powers she discovered, or until death finally came. The rest of Gorgonbane, they would come for certain. Those who survived the Ultra-Monstrosity's attack, anyway. He wouldn't know who had lived through the long fall until they were seen by his forces, or they simply showed up on his doorstep. When that happened, though, Cash would be ready. Axborn awoke in a field of crystal-clear grass. It bent and swayed in the wind, refracting the light of the white sun, shedding rainbow glints of light into the air like physical things. He couldn't even name all the colours he saw. The sky here was blue, and for a moment he thought that the first's grand enchantment must have succeeded, that it had done something to fundamentally alter the world, far beyond simply colouring the sky. Then he remembered his death. He recalled the fierce pain of asphyxiation, and a feeling like his body was being bruised everywhere at once. He saw again the bright explosion, felt again the shock at F's failure a moment before. He saw the face of the Super again who had murdered him. A face with no name. The face of the first beyond it, contorted with the same pains Axborn had been suffering. He had failed to protect F from assassination, and now the first was likely dead as well. He might even be around here somewhere. He saw and felt all these things, but he felt no anger, or remorse, or fear. It had happened as it was meant to, and he knew that when he looked, there would be a new path before him. Axborn sat up and looked around himself. He'd been lying in the shade of a tree, a glorious thing with bright pink leaves and a pure white trunk. Scythia would have loved it, to recline against his chest in its shade. Scythia. He felt the memory of sadness at the thought of the sorrow she must be feeling. Yet he smiled slightly. She would take his death far better than he would have taken hers. He might very well have cast himself into the chasm if she died. He didn't know how time flowed here, compared to the world of first life, but he wouldn't be surprised if his murderer was already dead, avenged by his wife of so many years. He rose. He and the lovely tree stood on a high hill that overlooked the path he had expected to see. It was narrow and gold, a gold so pure that it hardly looked gold anymore, but almost like crystal. On either side of the glorious path grew endless fields of crystal grass. The soil beneath it was all white, like snow. Hills rolled away in every direction, and between some of them there lapped little ponds or bigger lakes of water purer than any he'd ever seen. There was no hill without the crowning glory of one or more beautiful trees, and their leaves came in every colour imaginable. Axborn strode down the hill and onto the golden path. He followed it in the direction of the bright white sun. It was different than the one he was used to, for it had no tendrils, but was like the light of a billion gems put together, and yet without heat. It was moving across the sky, but the day felt timeless. Axborn thought that it would never set. As he moved down the path, he felt a growing sense of peace. He had already been at peace, but this was like something that was already hot, beginning to burn. It was the jollity of 3 steins of mead flowing into the happy abandon of a 7th. More than these, it was calm upon calm, a universe of contentedness. A stranger crested a hill nearby, walking slowly to converge with Axborn on the path. He was dressed in loose white clothing, and he had a golden belt about his waist. The man's skin was dark, as if tempered by an endless fire. His hair was white, and his eyes were like twin suns beneath his strong brow. He was not smiling, but his face looked joyous all the same. The man's hands were all that was not clean, for they were stained with soot, as if he had been working. The blacksmith, but as Axborn had never seen him depicted. "Hello, son," the man greeted. "I see you have found the path to your liking." "Hello," Axborn replied dumbly. In life he might have been shocked at this meeting. Now he was simply in awe. He fell to his knees. "I never thought," he stammered. "I mean, I knew, I knew, believed, but I never could have imagined." "Shh," said the man, and put a strong hand on Axborn's wild red mane. Father, touching son. "Your awe is enough for now. Words are not needed. Later you will know the songs of rightful praise, hear their melody. They fly to me from the city yonder." He pointed beyond the hills in the direction of the sun. Axborn did indeed hear the sound of song, though he could not understand the words. "Blacksmith," Axborn started. "It doesn't seem right. It doesn't seem like enough." "It is the best you have learned, is it not?" the man smiled. "Someday I will teach you a better name. Come, stand, and walk with me." Axborn obeyed, and they continued down the golden path. He knew now that they were moving toward the unseen city. What awaited him there? "I will show it to you," said the blacksmith. "But you will not tarry there long. You will not want to leave once you have known the joys of the glorious people." "Am I to leave then?" Axborn asked. He wasn't worried or disappointed, merely curious. Up until now he had never been unwilling to follow the glorious path. Whatever came next he was willing to do. "Yes, son," said the blacksmith. "There is more for you to do. You will miss the peace of this place, and yet you will take much of it with you. A new time is coming upon your world, and I desire to send one back who is able to stand through it all. Yes, one and more. What must I do, Father? Do as you have done, my son. You were given the gift of surety. You were able to stand beneath the weight of giants and not lose your feet. You were able to lead men and women and yet serve them in every battle. There is but one thing you must do differently for now. What is it? Offer retreat, said the blacksmith, looking directly into Axborn's eyes. It was an imperative without hardness, an admonition without blame. If your enemy listens and turns away from you, let him flee. So long as he keeps his back to you. If he turns toward you again or off to either side, you may do whatever is necessary to send him back to me. So I really will enter battle again, said Axborn. He'd never known for sure if that teaching about the glorious paths was true. You will, said the blacksmith, but not as you have seen it depicted. He laughed, a hearty sound that shook the ground and rippled the air, an immensely powerful expression of real humor. I do not sweat when I work, he said, voice low and amused. Nor do I wield my hammer so directly as the artists like to imagine. Of course, I understand that it may feel that way sometimes. My ways cannot be so easily understood. Someday you will know all, as I do. Until then, know that I do not tire, nor do I seek the harm of anyone, whether for my own ends or any other. Yes, Father, Axborn said. Am I to be a priest then? Oh, you all are, son, said the blacksmith with a smirk. You all tend to one idol or another, and those that believe in the glorious paths proclaim them as they live their lives. You, though, shall remain a great warrior. If Axborn had been capable of worry, he would have felt a great relief at this statement. As it was, he felt only the memory. There was no room for relief, for he felt more than complete already. When I go back, he said, will I feel pain, worry, sorrow again? You will feel what the situation requires, for you will be a new thing, said the blacksmith. Nothing about life, though, will be the same. Will Scythia still be my wife? Again, he was not worried but curious, in large part on Scythia's behalf. You will be flesh, of course, for I wish you to be seen, the blacksmith said. I would not separate yours from hers, and therefore I tell you, yes, you will still be husband to the woman who has loved you rightly. And the one who murdered me, Axborn said, shall I seek revenge? It was an honest question concerned only with the notion of justice. You must not, said the blacksmith. The murderer yet lives, but must serve another purpose before they return to me. You will show them the true meaning of mercy. Yes, Father, Axborn said. And though your friends may still call you Axborn, I give you this, the blacksmith said. In his hand was a white stone, attached to the end of a golden chain. In the center of the stone was an engraving. Read it, said the blacksmith. It said, Arnhem, but the word would not escape Axborn's lips, to be heard in the wider world. "This is your new name," the blacksmith said, "known only to you who receive it. Even were you to speak it to another, they would not comprehend it, nor be capable of repeating it back to you. Even Scythia will not be able to grasp it until she too has come to meet me on the path." Axborn took the stone, slipped its chain around his neck and felt the authority it granted. The 10 great skills ignited deep in his restored flesh. 10 and more. He knew now that nothing could destroy him unless he were to forsake the name. He didn't even think that would be possible. "Come, see your new self," said the blacksmith. He led the way off the path to a still pond in a hollow between 2 hills. He washed his hands clean in the pure water so that the soot made it opaque. Immediately the water started to dissolve the soot and became clear again, but before it did, Arnhem saw his own reflection. He'd never been one for mirrors, for he knew he was not a handsome man, but he did know his own image. Here he looked much the same. He'd kept the dignity of his ripe age, his low brow and deep-set eyes. The eyes were brighter though, silver, like the moonlight. Any freckles or moles had disappeared, and there was a glow to his skin like that of a newborn babe. His hair was still wild and untamed, but its fiery red had been purified so that it truly looked aflame. He was himself, but renewed. Arnhem looked up at the blacksmith. "I can only say thank you, Father," he said. "It is only what I have promised," said the blacksmith. "You will be a guardian to the world, and not only Overland, but every land. Remember to let the others do their work, for though you can do many things now, you cannot live their lives for them." "How will I know when to act and when to refrain?" Arnhem asked. "You will know." The blacksmith held out a hand, clean now from the soot of his forge, and drew Arnhem up onto his feet. "Come," he said. "Let us go and see the city. There is yet time before you must go." They walked together down the glorious path, and Arnhem was treated to awe after awe as truths and beauties that he never had guessed at were revealed to him.